welcome to Property Matters here on Dublin South FM. You can contact the show on Twitter, Facebook or LinkedIn at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. Your host for today is myself, Carol Tallon, and I'm delighted to be joined by Kate English, Chief Economist and Head of Ireland Research and Insights at Cushman Wakefield, and Kate's colleague, Aisling Tanham, Chartered Surveyor and Director who runs the Office Disposal Team at Cushman and Wakefield in Ireland. So you're both very welcome, Kate and Aisling. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
So, Kate, I might start with you. You're Chief Economist and Head of Research and Insights, and you and your department issued a report on the office market in the last kind of week or 10 days. So you might just run us through some of the headline figures of that.
Of course, yes. So in the last week or so, we released our Q3 report. So that it counts for all activity in the market up until the end of September. And it was a particularly interesting quarter for the office market, and I suppose there was a number of reasons for that. So since COVID began last March, April time, we've obviously seen quite a reduction in our volume of take-up within the office market. And when we classify take-up here at Cushman and Wakefield, it's when fit-outs are complete, the building or the space is handed over to the occupier and they have moved into that space. So obviously, with everything that happened, multiple lockdowns, there was a reduction in that take-up levels, and there was a real kind of sense of a temporary pause placed on market. As we saw that temporary pause from the take-up side of things, our availability increased on the other side as well. But since the start of this year, and this is consistently with our contact with our office colleagues, so Aisling and other members of the team, there has been a turn in sentiment within the market. Q2 was when we began to initially actually see this reflect in figures, and particularly in reserved space. So your reserved space is almost the initial process for eventually space beginning to be taken up. So it's a real indicator of pipeline activity that's coming on stream. And Q3, I did expect to see that we would continue to see that rise in reserve space take place. But what was particularly interesting this quarter is not only did we see a rise in the reserve space, but we also saw a rise in the volume of space which was signed. And this happened a lot quicker, to be honest, than what we anticipated, both here in Ireland, but also across Europe. And I suppose that really reflects this bounce back of activity that is continuing to be witnessed on the ground. So we saw a rise in reserve space, a rise in signed space, but then on the flip side of that, we also saw a reduction in our net availability figure. And the reason this is important is because this is the first reduction in our net availability figure that we've had since COVID began. That translates to then we have a reduction in your vacancy rate figure as well. So when you put that in the context of everything that has happened over the past 18 months, and I suppose all the questions that have been put out there, particularly by the media as to the role the office has to play going forward, the fact that in Q3 2021 that we began to see that recovery take place in actual figures is quite astonishing, and frankly something that I didn't expect to see probably until another quarter or two. So that's everything from a supply and a demand side. The final piece then that we also have in this report, or those figures that were released, is also on the construction side of the market. So at the beginning of COVID, we had quite a volume of space under construction. It was over 450,000 square meters. We haven't had a whole pile of new starts commence over the last years, but we are still continuing to see completions in the market. So obviously the volume of completions has declined as we've gone through periods of where construction has been closed. But we have had a number of space complete over the last number of months as well. But important of that, so we have over 100,000 square meters that are due to complete before year end. And to an outsider looking in, that would look like a substantial amount of space that's due to hit the market and potentially cause that trend that I've said in the vacancy rate declining to turn direction and begin to rise upwards again. But when we look at a breakdown of all that space that's under construction at the moment and due to complete before year end, a very, very high proportion of that is already pre-let. We're up over 70% of it. So by that I mean that there's already 70% of what's due to complete before year end has a tenant attached to it. So if it completes before year end, or if it even falls into the new year, we may end up in a kind of scenario where there are some fit out activities still continuing. But in theory, it shouldn't impact our availability and vacancy rate going forward, because that space is already accounted for. But so in a nutshell, I suppose I don't want to answer for too long because we want to move on to other topics as well. But what we're really seeing come through in those figures is that we're seeing that bounce back in activity. That's very evident in our reserved space and now in our signed space also. And that is your pipeline for take-up. While on the availability side, we are beginning to see that decline happen in availability and in vacancy rates. And as the market continues to recover, those trends should both continue to go in that direction. So it's a fascinating quarter for the market, and frankly, one that did take me a little bit by surprise.
Yeah, you know, there's so much in what you've gone through there. Actually, we have a bit to unpack. So you're right when you describe it as particularly interesting, because actually there's a bit of a juxtaposition there. But I suppose, well, first of all, could you maybe just confirm what's the lag between, say, how you defined take up and say signed? So what would generally be the time lag between not even kind of reserved, would say signed and
signed to take up? So that's a very good question, and frankly it's one that has changed in more recent times. So typically we probably would have had a quarter to 2 quarters max between your space being signed and moving to taking up. But that period has increased a little bit during I suppose, the pandemic time. And the reason for that is because with lockdowns, our fit out periods was impacted. There's also obviously a shortage of labour and a shortage of materials as well. So our fit out period is taking longer now than what it previously would have been. So we're still trying to get a greater handle as to how much that lag period has increased, or it certainly hasn't decreased. But it's one that I don't think I can actually put a definite time frame or figure on at the moment, because the market is dynamic and has changed so much. Ashing, you may have a slightly different answer to that, but or a bit more insight.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the size as well. So the size of the take-up. Is it a huge significant space like a Salesforce tower and the fitting out period that would take for something like that, as opposed to a smaller space as well? So I think it's very fluid. There's no one correct answer to that. But to back up, Carol, some of what Kate was saying here, if you take our demand, so if we go back to September 2020, we track all of the active demand. So we track every occupier in the market who's actively looking for space. And if we rewind 12 months, our demand tracker showed about 2.7 million square foot of active demand. And if you fast forward 12 months and you see, well, where is that figure today? We're currently tracking about 5.1 million square foot of active demand. So that's risen from about 105 requirements to about 280 to make up that 5.1 million square foot.
And so, I mean, they're huge figures, but I think you touched on something really important there at the start, which is the size of take up at an individual level. So can we decipher between maybe a trend and one or two very high performing or high demand occupants? Because one of the things we've seen in recent reports, you know, when we're looking at the market on a quarterly basis, you can have one or two transactions that distort the findings. So this is why actually the size of individual take-up can be important as well. So right now, are we seeing the start of a trend, or is that too early to say in terms of COVID? Or, you know, in terms of demand, is it, I suppose, is it more of an ad hoc, or are we seeing the start of a trend in terms of demand?
In terms of demand, I would say that we are always going to have a market where you have one or two deals in a year that can cause a particular spike or potentially skew the figures. And that's always going to be the case. You're always going to hope to have those one or two particularly large occupiers that year. I think when we're talking about this, it's probably good to differentiate the two sides of the market that we're seeing at the moment. So the live requirement side of things that Ashing mentioned there, that's very much so the beginning of your journey of your demand and your take-up. And within that, yes, certainly over the last 2 months, we have seen a couple of large-scale requirements come onto the market that would be much larger than perhaps the average. But these are always going to be a feature of the market. But if we look to what's happening in our reserved and in our signed space, those figures aren't being propped up by one or two deals. So it is much more a trend of a broader based recovery within the market. I think it's probably also useful at this juncture to maybe bring in the idea of who is driving this demand within the market. Because I think your average size deal, or where those particularly large requirements come from, can be dependent on where the sector is as well.
And Karen, we would have seen, if you take even forget COVID ever happening, a lot of the largest deals that would have taken place in the market, going back to say 2017 onwards, would have been driven by your technology companies. But interestingly now, if you take the top 5 biggest requirements in the market, they're about 50-50 in terms of professional services and technology. So we're now seeing our professional services firms and reserving space and big chunks of space too, Carol, not just your smaller size. So something that was very driven by technology going back over the last 5 years, really our top requirements now are about 50-50 professional services and technology. And I think that's a very interesting point, and that's very positive for the market overall, that we're not just being driven by these big tech firms, that our professional services firms are equally looking at their move and what they're going to do. And another cohort of and another point that's quite interesting about who is out there and who is looking, we have a lot of people looking for flexibility within their lease, and the reason they're looking for this on the smaller size now, not your larger requirements who have very set 10-year plans, 5-year plans, but are those that have had a very good COVID, so have managed to recruit a significant number of people. And the only reason they're afraid to commit to a longer term lease, a 12-year term certain, is because their growth has been so substantial. So what they have done is they've taken up a lot of what's referred to as grey space, so sublease space. So we've had a huge increase in activity for good quality fitted space, to the point now I think we're going to have a shortage in the city of quality fitted space on a flexible lease. So where occupiers may have moved to a bigger building or looking to sublease. And we certainly get an awful lot of inquiries and calls for this type of space, and in many cases have a couple of parties almost not bidding against each other, but really interested in the same space. And that's a good news story in terms of the reason they want it. It's because of growth.
Yeah, I think it's interesting even to position that, as you say, as a good news story, because the reality is a lot of the commentary coming out would lead us to believe that the majority of space is being occupied by a small number of international tech companies. So it's really interesting to hear that there's a 50-50 mix. In terms of the professional services firms, can you trace back, say, in terms of the impact of Brexit? We know that professional services firms are either introducing a foothold in Ireland, or they're expanding their existing foothold in Ireland. In terms of the professional services, you touched on COVID, because we know that COVID has not been negative for every business. Some businesses, it's actually been a massive driver. In terms of the professional services firms that are looking for quite large space at the moment, can you trace that to more of a COVID impact, Brexit, or something else?
They often don't tell us the full details of the size of the requirement, and the size and why they need it, and what's it as a result of. We don't often get for sure, well, this is Brexit related or not. And sometimes we can see that it is, but it's not something that they would openly usually speak about. But what we have seen from before COVID to now, I suppose we're not past COVID yet, no. we're beginning to see the other side, is really the race to quality. So it is people looking at their existing space and saying, oh, do you know what? We've got a break option coming up, or we've a lease expiry, and we really need to improve the quality of the environment that we're in. So it's not necessarily that their size requirement has doubled on the back of Brexit or anything like that. It's just that the space that they do use, they want better space. They want more sustainable space. They want buildings in good locations, with with particularly access to good public transport, because as we all know, the city's changing and how we get around is changing. And I don't know about you, Carol, but when I went into town after not being in for a few months during the height of COVID, where there was once 2 lanes of traffic, there was now a bike lane, a bus lane, and 1 lane. And our city is changing, and the importance of accessibility to occupiers is becoming more and more evident, as well as your quality of space and particularly sustainability credentials.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear you talk about the race to quality, because I think it's such an important one in terms of staff retention. And that was prior to COVID, but now post-COVID, where the conversation of the future of work and perhaps more hybrid working, are you seeing that change, the fit out requirements of companies at the moment? Because actually the fit out awards are coming up in the next month or so, and so we're seeing all of the shortlisted categories with their shortlisted projects. So actually my LinkedIn timeline is full of stunningly finished offices.
Yeah.
We just opened our second office in Galway, and we opted to go outside the city into the village of Carrow, and outside my office I can sometimes see cows and all sorts. So our office fit out level, it's convenient, it's in the community, but it's not at the same level, say, as we would expect if we were in Dublin. And don't get me wrong, if we were in Galway city centre, it would be a different conversation. But I've seen that the quality fit out has become almost part of the corporate identity in a way that it never was before.
Yeah, and it's about retention, and it's about being in an inspiring environment. And I think that's really important for occupiers and getting people back to the office, is that it's a productive, open, and a space to collaborate, a space to break out, but also a space where you can have a bit of quiet time as well. But equally, your location is as an important part of that as the quality of the build as well. And we have seen some occupiers who've changed their fit out. We've seen others who haven't. And these are where we're looking at this is really those that would have committed to being pre-lets before COVID and would have started their fit outs and etc. And some have changed it, others haven't. And we've seen many of our big occupiers come out with their statements on what is going to happen when they return, whether they're returning now on a phased basis or whether it's going to be the new year. And really, they're using their real estate as their recruitment tool to get people back to the office. So I think it's going to become more and more important over the years is the finishes, the fit out, and also the sustainability credentials will matter to the employees. So it's not just about the employer's commitment to sustainability or commitment to lowering their carbon footprint, but it's equally going to be the requirement of the next generation of workers coming up is that they work in a sustainable environment, and that the ethos of their employer and indeed their landlord is to sustainability. And some might think, it's what everybody's talking about, but it is true, and it's going to become more and more important, not just to employers, to landlords, but also to the employees within the building.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with you in terms of ESG. We're seeing this becoming a huge driver, but at the moment it's very much concentrated on the occupier. So if we take a step back and look at the building, I know in other jurisdictions, particularly in certain states in the US, there is a requirement to report on the energy performance of a building prior to leasing. Where are we from, say, a regulatory position in Ireland in terms of giving genuine importance to ESG metrics beyond a best practice?
Yeah, well, I think that your state organisations are saying now that they won't lease a building unless it's got an A3 building energy cert on it. Your overseas occupiers are really driving this as much as what we would see being in legislation as well, because they've made commitments and very openly made statements about being carbon neutral, carbon negative in some cases. So I think it is being driven. It'll be driven by all parts, Carl. It'll be driven by those making legislation to do with it. It'll also be driven by the occupiers and the landlord's desire to do it for their own footprint.
Because you're actually dealing with occupiers, and we know that, or potential occupiers, and we know that there can be a bit of a time lag. What are you, I presume, you know, you're tapping into the international Cushman and Wakefield network there to be able to really tap into trends in terms of fit out, and whether they're impacted by COVID or just trends that were perhaps in train prior to COVID. I mean, what are we likely to see next in office design in Ireland?
I think we're likely to see, particularly if people are building, a building designed to be multi-tenanted, that there's a lot of sense of community within the building. So there's spaces to pause and spaces to break out, where you have your accidental encounters. So you meet and you network with other people within your building. And I do think we're going to see more of that. I suppose iPropertyRadio were the first ones to do it down in Windmill Lane, in their office building, Windmill Lane in the Windmill Quarter. And they have a town hall space on the ground floor that equally is a breakout space. And I think we're going to see more of that, more of these open spaces, breakout spaces, spaces for people to have a bit of quiet time or to pause before they go up to meeting on their floor. And I think we're going to see more of that built into design. Also, importance of access to natural light, important to access to terrace spaces. And I'm leasing a building down in the South Docks at the moment, and almost 10% of the building is terrace spaces. There's about 16,000 square foot of terrace spaces, and it'll be about the finish of these spaces, that they're usable, that you can go out on them, that you can sit on them, that there's maybe shading in parts of it, or indeed outdoor meeting pods that you can put into these terrace spaces. And I think occupiers are going to look more and more about those type of finishes to buildings. Another area that gets a lot of attention is actually in the basement of buildings, and how your showers are fitted out, your bike spaces. Is there electric car charging spaces? How many is there? Can they adapt more of them? Is there spaces to charge your electric bikes, to charge your electric scooters? It's all of these points to attract talent, really, and how are the occupiers getting to work, and then how are they using the spaces, and how can we best design our buildings around that? So that's really the trends on top of sustainability that we see really occupiers using within their fit out.
You know, that's a really good win-win kind of it's a good win-win scenario for the building owners, the building occupiers, and the team members coming into it. So that's a really positive one to hear. Before we finish up, I just want to maybe look 6 to 9 months into the future. You know, you mentioned to the end of this year, 70% of what's likely to be completed in terms of new offices, that we're at about 70% pre-let. So in terms of availability, that's down, but obviously there's been delays in completion. I'm conscious now with increased construction costs. How is that likely to impact, say, space that has been reserved but not yet delivered? The projects are likely to be escalating in cost. Is there a way to factor that in? Is I suppose my first question, perhaps Kate, you might look at that, and also where are we likely to land in terms of availability by the middle of next year?
I think firstly to point out, it's a difficult question to answer in terms of that. I think that we are still going to see a rise in our gross availability figure. So when I said that there had been a decline in our availability, it's in the net availability figure, because that extracts out anything that is signed or reserved. So it's space that's been advertised on the market, be it that it's under construction or actually available standing stock, but there is now a name attached to it. So it extracts that out. So at the moment, we actually have where if you were to graph the two figures, your gross availability and your net availability figure, they're going in different directions. So that gross availability figure is still trickling up. Now, the pace of growth of it is beginning to taper off. And that follows trends that we're also seeing across other jurisdictions, from be it in the US, in Canada, in some of our European markets as well. While that net availability figure is in decline, our view or our forecast in-house here would say that gross availability figure, that gross vacancy rate figure, probably will see another rise over the next number of quarters as well. But as I said, that pace of it is certainly going to taper off. I think by the middle of next year, that could have increased further. But as we enter then into the second half of next year, that's when that gross availability figure will begin to decline. judging by all the activity that's happening from a reserved space, a signed space, and also in the requirement side of things, or even in the number of viewings that you guys are doing at the moment, I would see that net availability figure continuing to decline. So I do believe for the next year, we are still going to be looking at a market where those two figures may be at odds for another couple of quarters. When we're looking at the construction side of things then, so I suppose, thankfully, maybe from a research perspective, the majority of space that's under construction at the moment is pre-let. We don't actually have a huge volume of it that is reserved. That is still to start feeding through yet. So therefore, all that space that's under construction has someone fully signed up into it. So I don't think we're going to see a big difference into how much of that space actually becomes net available to the market. Because once something is signed, it doesn't change. It's not going to really have an impact there. I think from a construction side, and this is again something that I've regularly noticed while doing the stats, is that unfortunately, it is difficult to keep things to expected completion time. So we'll always have a number of units that end up spilling over into the next quarter. And I've no doubt that we'll see this again at the end of this year. But that's where that construction side of things may come into play a little bit more in terms of what's under construction. And I may see another little bit of delay in terms of ones that are due to complete maybe at the first half of next year, getting pushed out that quarter or two again. But what's really important here, and this is what I view from a research perspective, when we sit down and try to logically think out of, well, where is the market going to go over the next while? Everything that's under construction at the moment and doesn't have a name attached to it, so isn't reserved or isn't signed, the majority of that is still off completion date to some extent. So a lot of that will not complete until the end of next year, if not even into 2023. But during this time period, we are also then experiencing a recovery in demand and more activity happening. So it almost presents a bit of a buy time for that space to become pre-let before it actually reaches completion stage. So from that perspective, the volume of space that's under construction at the moment and the timelines of when it's actually due to complete, from where the market is performing at the moment, I still believe we have enough time for things to recover more greatly for a large proportion of that to be indeed pre-let before it completes as well, or certainly reaching signed stages once it's near completion stage. I think you'd probably be in agreement of that as well, given the activity you're seeing at the moment. And I do think one final thing, sorry, when you get me talking about stats, it's hard to commit to that.
This is exactly what we needed to learn. So please.
That's hugely important this time round as well, because I know there's a lot of comparison happening at the moment for people kind of going back to maybe when the market last took a dip in 08, 09, 10, is you must remember over 80% of what's under construction at the moment is in the CBD. We actually have very little activity happening outside our core Dublin city market. And when we look at the trends of where demand is at the moment, and back to that even flight to quality that Aisling mentioned earlier, people looking to be in good quality spaces and good locations, where development is happening at the moment is happening in the right places at the right time. If we're seeing that return to quality, and there was a lot of questions at the beginning of COVID of would we see a shift in where take-up was happening? Because the CBD has typically accounted for between, I think on average, your annual long run average is about 50% to take up, but in the past 5 years, that had increased to about between 60 and 70%. And there was a lot of questions coming through. I know I got asked this from our European counterparts as well, and in the UK, as to, are we seeing a shift of people moving to the suburbs? Is it the end of having all your space within the city centre? And that frankly hasn't happened, and we haven't seen it transpire through the stats. We haven't seen it come through in the live requirement data that's there. So again, if everything that's the majority of what's under construction is within the CBD, we're in a market where we're seeing a return of demand, but a return of demand all focusing on a flight to quality and product within the city centre. Again, it gives a form of comfort of that space that's coming to the market. I do believe will be absorbed, and this rise in availability is certainly temporary.
Okay, that's an interesting one, but it actually brings up a larger point, which I appreciate is probably a conversation for another day. But that is around, you say that development is happening within the central business district. It's and the right place for it. It just opens up the bigger question of the availability of affordable housing for team members. And I know bigger conversation for another day, and we won't even get into that. But actually, before we finish up today, Aisling, this month was hailed as supposedly the mass return to the office. Has that happened? And, how are your occupiers faring this month?
Yeah, well, I think what we have seen, if we talked about the increase in demand there, a lot of that increase in demand has come over the last 4 months. So people have recognised we're going back. We're not seeing a big bang date of 22nd of October where everybody's going back full time, and that's the change. We're not seeing that. What we are seeing is the slow return to the office. So we're seeing people coming back in, like a lot of the state organisations now are back in 1 day a week, and to gradually build that up. We've seen others who have pushed back their return to the office to January, and we've seen plenty of others, particularly in your professional services sector, more so than your tech, who are bringing people back now, slowly, on about a 3-day week is your average. Even if their goal is to bring it back to full time, we've really haven't seen a big light switch go on and everybody goes back. But we're slowly seeing more and more people. And Carol, you'd see it yourself if you go into town, and if you go into Dublin city centre, like the train stations are a lot busier. There's a lot more people on their bike, in their car. Traffic is back. It's killing me in the morning, so I'm back on my bike. But you've seen that change, but it's slowly happening. I think a lot of the goals are to bring people back between now, really, and the new year. So it is varying by company to company, and more on your professional services coming back sooner than your technology. Technology is a bit slower. Your technology employers are a bit slower to bring your big technology, a bit slower to bring their employees back. This goal is over the next couple of months.
Yeah, I think this will be an interesting conversation to pick up maybe after Q1 next year. But for now, thank you for joining us. That was Kate English, Chief Economist and Head of Research and Insights at Cushman Wakefield, Ireland, and Aisling Tanham, Director and Chartered Surveyor at Cushman Wakefield. We need to take a quick break. Stay tuned.